He lifted his champagne glass, and the ballroom fell silent, the way rooms go silent when powerful men have decided to speak. 200 guests turned toward my son's father-in-law, silver cufflinks, measured smile, the voice of a man who had spent decades making himself impossible to ignore. "To my daughter," he began, "and to the life she's finally going to have." I sat at a round table near the back, table 11. I'd checked the seating chart when we arrived and understood immediately what it meant. Not an oversight, not a mistake. A message. My hands rested flat on the white linen. Steady. I had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. I'd planned it the way I used to plan controlled burns. Every variable accounted for, every exit mapped, nothing left to chance. He spoke about family, about security, about what it truly means to give a daughter a foundation worth standing on. His eyes swept the room until they found mine. "Leah grew up understanding what genuine stability looks like," he said. "I can only hope that as she builds this new chapter, she'll always recognize the difference between where she came from, a small, graceful pause, and what she now has the chance to become." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. My son sat rigid at the head table, the muscle in his jaw working steadily. My daughter-in-law stared at her plate, shoulders drawn in, a woman trying to make herself smaller than she was. She didn't look at me. I understood why she couldn't. My son's father-in-law raised his glass higher. 200 people lifted theirs. I stood up. "Welcome to today's narrative. Please support the channel by hitting that like button, joining the Quartz Revenge family, and dropping a comment to let us know where you're watching from." A quick reminder: this story contains dramatized elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. The specific names and locations are creative choices, but the core truths here about silence, about justice, about what we owe the people we've lost, those are real. My name is Clint Foss. I spent 31 years as a fire captain in a small manufacturing city in eastern Ohio, a place built on steel and shift work, and the particular dignity that comes from making things with your hands. I understand heat. I understand the way fire moves, the way it looks for the cheapest path through, the way it punishes whoever cut corners the most. That knowledge has served me in ways I never wanted. 25 years ago, on a Thursday night in January, I was home putting my 18-month-old son to sleep when my pager went off. Structure fire, Darby Mills Textile, off Route 40. All units respond. My wife was working the closing shift at Darby Mills that night. She'd been their floor supervisor for 4 years. The job paid better than anything else in town, and we had a baby and a mortgage, and the particular quiet terror that comes with being young and responsible for another human life. I heard the address and I put my son in his playpen, and I ran. The fire was already through the roof when I arrived. 3 pumpers on scene. The suppression system, the sprinkler system that should have activated the moment heat crossed 155 degrees, had not fired. I noticed it immediately. You don't spend that many years reading fire scenes without learning what silence sounds like. The sprinklers were silent. We pulled 2 workers out alive. 3 didn't make it. My wife was one of the 3. They found her near the emergency exit on the east wall. The county fire marshal signed off within 2 weeks. The company, Darby Mills, owned by a holding group I'd never heard of, issued a statement of condolences and paid out a settlement to the families of each victim. The settlement came with a confidentiality clause. I was 29 years old. I had an 18-month-old boy and a check I didn't want. I didn't cash it. I kept the pocket watch my wife had given me on our wedding day instead. A small silver thing, nothing expensive, with an inscription on the back, "For the man who runs toward the fire." The glass face cracked when I dropped it in the hospital parking lot the night they told me she was gone. I never had it repaired. Some cracks you leave alone, they remind you. I raised my son by myself for the next 25 years, and I won't pretend it was easy, because it wasn't, and pretending otherwise would dishonor every night. I ate cereal for dinner so he could have the hot meal. The first year was survival, plain and simple. My mother drove 3 hours every Sunday to help. My crew at Station 6 showed up with casseroles and yard work without being asked, because that's what firemen do for their own. My son learned to walk in the station break room. He was curious about everything, that boy. Took things apart to see how they worked. By 12, he was building model bridges in the garage, testing their load limits with textbooks stacked on top. By 16, he was sketching structural plans freehand, just for fun. He got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship. I picked up extra shifts for 3 years to cover the rest. He called every Sunday night, same as his mother used to call her parents. Same ritual, different voice on the other end. When he graduated with his engineering degree, I sat in that stadium in the rain and didn't care at all about being wet. I thought I'd given him everything he needed to build a good life. I taught him to read load charts, to check his work twice, to never sign off on anything he hadn't personally verified. I told him the same thing every time I dropped him somewhere that mattered. Do it right the first time, or don't do it at all. I didn't know the ground was about to shift. 8 months ago, my son called on a Sunday evening. He had that quality in his voice he'd had since he was small. The sound of someone trying to contain something larger than usual. "Dad," he said, "I met someone." Her name was Leah. They'd met at a conference in Columbus 6 months earlier. She was an environmental attorney. "Smart," he said. She argued back. I could hear in the way he described her that this was the real thing. I asked her last name. He told me. I sat down at my kitchen table. Outside, an Ohio October was stripping the maples clean, pushing cold under the door. "That's a good name," I said, because I needed a moment to think. After we hung up, I searched the name on my laptop. It took 11 minutes to find what I'd been afraid of finding for 25 years. Leah's father had acquired Darby Mills through a holding company in 1998, 3 years before the fire that killed my wife. He had divested it quietly in 2003, 2 years after the settlement payments, after the investigation closed, after the names faded from the local paper. He had moved on to bigger things since: real estate, commercial development, the kind of money that makes a man feel untouchable. He sat on the board of a hospital foundation. He played golf with state senators. And his daughter was falling in love with my son. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat at the kitchen table until midnight. Then I put the glass in the sink and got to work. It took 3 months to build a case solid enough to stand on. I'd learned early in my career that evidence doesn't wait for you to be ready. You gather it methodically, you label it, you protect it, and you don't move until you're certain. I called Kay Breslin, a journalist I'd worked with years back on an arson investigation, someone I knew was thorough and didn't scare easily. I met her at a diner outside Columbus on a Tuesday morning and laid out everything I had. The original fire report, the suppression system specifications from the county building records, the holding company trail. She went quiet for a long time. "I need a source inside," she said. I had one. Lloyd had worked maintenance at Darby Mills for 11 years before the fire. He'd called me once, about 3 years after, and then gone silent when I pushed. I tracked him down through a mutual contact. He was living up in Canton. He picked up on the second ring. "Clint," he said, "I wondered when you'd come back around." Lloyd had kept copies, not because he'd planned to use them, but out of fear, the way people keep things that scare them close. Inspection logs showing the sprinkler system had been red-tagged 6 weeks before the fire for a faulty solenoid valve. A work order to repair it, signed and then canceled. A memo from the facility director, signed on behalf of ownership, authorizing a postponement of repairs to avoid shutting down the production line during the holiday order season. The repair was rescheduled for February. My wife died in January. Kay spent 6 weeks verifying everything Lloyd gave us. She also found the current violations at my son's father-in-law's newest commercial property, a warehouse facility in Newark where fire suppression equipment had been cited twice in 3 years, and both citations had quietly vanished from the county record. Same pattern, 25 years later, different building, same math. He hasn't changed, Kay said. He's just moved to bigger properties. I looked at the evidence spread across her desk and felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, but the particular clarity that comes when you finally understand the full shape of what you've been carrying. 6 weeks before the wedding, something happened that I didn't learn about until much later. My son's father-in-law called Leah to lunch. Not my son, just Leah, alone. A private dining room downtown, the kind of meeting designed to leave no witnesses. She told me about it afterward, standing in a hotel corridor while my son was down the hall speaking with investigators. Her voice was steady. Her hands weren't. Her father had a folder on the table when she arrived. He opened it before she'd finished sitting down. Environmental compliance documents from the Newark warehouse. With Leah's signature on the filing line. She had never signed those documents. She had never even seen them. But her name was there, clean and confident, on 12 separate filings, forged well enough that disputing them would take months she didn't have. He told her what he wanted very simply. He was going to make a toast at the wedding. He was going to say things about me that she wouldn't like. She was going to sit at the head table and let it happen. If she said a word in my defense, if she made a scene, if she warned my son, those documents would go to the Ohio EPA and the state fire marshal's office before the reception ended. Her law license would be under review by Monday. He called it insurance, she told me. He said every business needs insurance. She had refused at first. That's when he mentioned my son's engineering firm. 3 of its largest clients were companies that my son's father-in-law had influence over. One phone call, he says, Ed, and the firm would begin losing contracts within the week. She sat frozen at that head table on her wedding day because she believed her silence was the only wall standing between her husband's career and ruin. She was trying to protect him the only way she thought she could. I understood that. I had done something similar for 25 years, carrying what I knew without the means to use it, telling myself I was being patient rather than paralyzed. What I didn't know was that 2 weeks before the wedding, my son had come to find me. He showed up at my house on a Thursday afternoon and set a manila envelope on the kitchen counter without a word. Then he leaned against the wall and looked at me the way he'd looked at me when he was 12 and had broken something he knew mattered. I found it in his study, he said. I was looking for a notarized document he'd promised to print for me. I found this instead. Inside the envelope were copies of the internal Darby Mills investigation file, not the public version. The real one. Emails between the facility director and ownership. A legal memo on how to frame the settlement payments to minimize liability exposure. And a cost-benefit analysis, completed 2 weeks before the fire, comparing the expense of repairing the sprinkler system against the projected cost of an insurance claim in a worst-case scenario. My wife's life had been weighed against a line item on a spreadsheet. My son watched me read through it. He didn't say anything until I set the last page down. She was my mother, he said. She was. He knew the whole time. Yes. He walked to the window. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the hedge. Ordinary Thursday. The ordinary world going about its business. What do we do? He asked. I told him about Kay, about Lloyd, about the 6 months of work already done, about the morning of the wedding. He was quiet for a long time. Then, you were going to do this without telling me. I was going to tell you, when I had enough, that you couldn't doubt it. He turned around. He looked older than he had 5 minutes ago. What do you need from me? I pulled out my phone and called Kay. I visited the old Darby Mills site the day before the wedding. The building had been demolished years ago. A storage facility stood there now. Anonymous gray metal walls behind a chain-link fence. No marker, no memorial. Nothing to indicate that 3 people had died there on a January night because someone had decided a repair could wait until February. I stood at the fence for a while. Cold came off the pavement in waves. No wind, no birds. I took the pocket watch from my coat, cracked face, worn inscription. "Tomorrow," I said to the empty ground, to her. "Tomorrow it ends." The ceremony the following afternoon was at a renovated event center downtown. High ceilings, warm light, the string quartet doing its best with something classical I couldn't name. I sat in the 3rd row and watched my son stand at the altar, with his shoulders set and his hands clasped. My daughter-in-law came down the aisle in ivory silk. She looked beautiful. She looked like a woman carrying something she couldn't set down yet. The officiant pronounced them married. My son's father-in-law sat in the front row with the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has arranged everything to his advantage. He hadn't arranged everything. The reception moved to the adjoining ballroom. Kay was already seated when I arrived. Club soda, unhurried, professional. Lloyd was 2 tables over. He caught my eye and gave one nod. Everything was in position. Dinner service came and went. My son's father-in-law worked the room the way men like him always work rooms. Brief handshakes, short laughter, the careful maintenance of alliances. He never came to my table. Then the plates were cleared, the room settled, he stood. He lifted his glass and he talked about family and stability and the gift of genuine security. He let his gaze find mine when he said that Leah had always understood what a real foundation looked like, and that he was grateful she would now have a husband who appreciated what that life required. 200 people turned their faces up toward him. I let him finish. I let him sit down satisfied. Then I stood. That was beautifully said. My voice carried easily across the room. 31 years of making yourself heard over the sound of burning buildings will do that. But before we raise our glasses to the future, I think everyone here deserves to understand something about the foundation this family actually built on. He went still. Behind him, the projection screens I'd arranged with the venue's AV team, booked under the description of a wedding photo display, came to life. The first image was the internal cost-benefit analysis from Darby Mills. I explained it simply, the way I'd learned to brief incident commanders. A fire suppression system had been flagged for repair. The repair had been deliberately postponed to protect production volume during the holiday season, and 3 workers had died in the resulting fire. One of them was my wife, my son's mother. I heard gasps, chairs scraped. Someone across the room said, "Oh God," in a voice that cut right through the noise. The second slide was Kay's documentation of the Newark warehouse. The suppression citations, the missing records, the same cost-saving logic applied to a different building 25 years on. The third was the forged compliance documents bearing my daughter-in-law's signature, alongside a sworn statement from a forensic document examiner confirming they were fraudulent. I explained what he had threatened to do with them. I let the room understand what kind of man had just given a toast about family values. Your own people kept copies of everything, I said, because Lloyd had earned that. Every falsified record, every forged signature, every decision that was made when a human life was a variable in a financial calculation. My son's father-in-law had gone the color of old ash. His hands gripped the edge of the table. "This is defamation. I'll have you in court before." "With what assets?" Kay said from her table, clear and unhurried. "The federal hold was placed this morning." The room came apart after that. Chairs, voices, someone near the exit already, on a phone. Security moved toward the head table. My son crossed to his wife and stood between her and her father without a word. the way you stand between a fire and something you've decided to protect. Drop a 1 in the comments right now if you're still with me. And a quick reminder. This narrative contains dramatized elements created for storytelling and reflection. They took my son's father-in-law out through the service entrance. It seemed right, somehow. My son found me in the corridor outside the suite 20 minutes later. He looked like a man who had just set down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "She wants to explain," he said. Leah was sitting on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress, shoes off, hands in her lap. She told me about the lunch, the forged documents, the threat against my son's firm, the calculation she'd made in that private dining room, alone. That silence was the only protection available to her. I let her finish without interrupting. "You thought keeping quiet would keep him safe," I said. She nodded. "Your father has spent his entire career believing that silence is the same thing as safety. He built an empire on that belief." I kept my voice even. "He was wrong about it 25 years ago, and you were wrong about it today. But you were wrong because you were trying to protect someone you love. That's a different kind of mistake than what he made. He knew that. That's exactly why he chose you to threaten." My son was watching me from the chair by the window. "This is going to be hard for a while," I said. "For all of us. That's honest, and I won't pretend otherwise. But we're going to have those hard conversations out loud, not around each other. That's the only way any of this holds." I reached into my coat pocket and took out the watch. I set it on the nightstand between us. "My wife gave me this," I said. "She said it was for the man who runs toward the fire. What you both did tonight, each in the way you knew how, that was running toward something. That's worth something." My son looked at the watch. Then he looked up at me. "Thank you, Dad." The trial took 14 months. Lloyd testified for 4 hours on a Tuesday in March. Kay's reporting had already been picked up by 3 national outlets. The county fire marshal's office reopened the Darby Mills investigation. An independent forensic engineer confirmed what I had known since the night I stood in that parking lot watching the building burn. The suppression system had been operable. It had been deliberately disabled. My son's father-in-law took a plea on 6 counts, including falsification of safety records and criminal negligence resulting in wrongful death. He was sentenced the following November. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. I was at a cemetery in eastern Ohio, standing at my wife's headstone in the cold, the way I sometimes needed to stand there to feel the shape of things properly. I told her all of it, the evidence, the wedding, the testimony, the sentence. I told her about our son, standing at an altar with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, the way I'd always hoped he'd stand when something truly mattered. I told her about Leah, that she was sharp and principled and had made a bad decision for a good reason, and was now building something honest with the time she had. "You'd have liked her," I said. She argues back. "You always said that was the only thing worth doing with a man who thinks he's already right." The wind moved through the bare trees, Ohio doing what Ohio does. I ran my thumb across the cracked watch face in my coat pocket. They'd insisted I keep it. My son and his wife both. They said I'd carried it long enough that it belonged to me now in a way that couldn't be given away. Maybe they were right. 6 months after the sentencing, my son called on a Sunday evening. That quality again in his voice, the sound of something large being carefully contained. "We're going to have a baby," he said. I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, an Ohio spring was doing what Ohio springs do, slow, stubborn, unmistakable, green pushing up through gray. "Tell me everything," I said. And he did. I've spent a lot of years studying the way things phaeton. The hairline, fracture that spreads under load. The connection that looks solid until the pressure finds it. The moment when what was hidden finally surfaces. And you understand the damage was there the whole time, waiting for someone to look closely enough. I've also spent 31 years watching people run into burning buildings to pull strangers out. Ordinary people making an extraordinary choice in the space of a breath. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they decided the person inside was worth more than the fire. That's what my son did when he opened that envelope on my kitchen counter. That's what my daughter-in-law did when she finally stopped believing that silence was the same as safety. That's what Lloyd did quietly for 22 years, keeping copies he didn't know if he'd ever use because something in him couldn't bring himself to let it disappear entirely. Justice doesn't always arrive on schedule. It doesn't always arrive clean. But when you build it carefully, when you check your work and refuse to let it be buried, it holds. Build the thing that lasts, even when it takes 25 years, even when the cracks show. Especially then. Drop a 2 in the comments if you made it all the way through. I appreciate every one of you who stayed with this story. A quick reminder that this narrative contains dramatized elements designed for storytelling and reflection. If you have a story of your own about justice arriving late, about silence and what it costs, share it below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.